Now in this video, we're going to look at some applications involving our rectangular coordinates. And the first example we have here is an airplane flies from Keysville, Virginia in a straight line to Lynchburg, Virginia, which is located 27 miles north and 36 miles west of Keysville. And we want to know how far does the plane fly. So if we draw a little picture here, we can figure this out. If we start at Keysville, and it tells us that we're going to travel 27 miles north. So we're going to go 27 miles north of Keysville and 36 miles west. So that means we're going to go to the left here, 36 miles. Then how far does the plane fly if it's going to travel in a straight line from Keysville to Lynchburg? So that means we're looking at our direct flight here. And notice we actually would have a right triangle. So for this example, we could use the Pythagorean Theorem, which again says that a squared plus b squared equals c squared. And if we do that here, we're looking for this direct flight, which is our c. So then we would have c squared is equal to 27 squared plus 36 squared, and we would end up with c squared equals 27 squared, which is 729, plus 36 squared, which is 1296. So therefore c squared is equal to 2025. And once again here, we have to take the square root, so we find c. So if we take the square root of both sides, and again, we're going to use a positive because we're talking about the distance, we would end up with 45 miles. So if we're going to fly from Keysville to Lynchburg, it's only going to be a 45-mile direct flight. Now, we can set this up a different way, and we can set this up using the distance formula. And if we think about this problem another way, let's think of having our x and y axis here. And if we think of starting out the origin as being our location for Keysville, well, that means our starting point would be at the origin 0, 0. And then if we were to mark off that we were going to go 27 miles north, so that means we're going 27 up. And then if we're going to go 36 miles west, then we're going to go to the left 36. So I'm going to make that a negative 36 because we're going to the left of the origin on the x-axis. And that's going to give us our point right here. And the coordinates there would be negative 36, positive 27. So that is the location then of Lynchburg. 36 miles west and then 27 miles north. So, and we want to calculate the distance between the 2 points. So that means we could use our distance formula. And if you recall, the distance formula says the distance is the square root of x2 minus x1 squared plus y2 minus y1 squared. So here, if we're looking for that distance, we would take the square root of, and again, it may be helpful to label here. I'm going to call this one x1, y1. So up here we would have x2 and y2. So for x2 then, we're going to take a negative 36, okay, and subtract x1, which is 0, so that's all squared, plus our y2, which is 27, minus y1, which is 0, and that's going to be squared. And if you take a negative 36 minus 0, that's just going to be a negative 36 squared. And if we square a negative 36, that would be a positive 1296 plus 27 minus 0. We would have 27 squared, and if we square 27, that's going to be 729. And if you look, those are the exact same numbers we had over here using the Pythagorean theorem. So then, of course, here, if we add these together, you're going to end up with the square root of 2025. And then, of course, then the square root, we end up with 45 miles. So there's an example of two different ways you could think of the same problem. You could think of it as certainly using a right triangle in the Pythagorean theorem, or we can think of using our x and y axes and setting up from the origin and then plotting our point and simply finding the distance between the 2 points. So at this point, you can actually choose which method that you prefer. And what I always tell my students is that pick the one that makes sense to you and use that one, because whatever is more logical to your way of thinking is the one that you're going to remember and understand. All right, our next example, it says that we have the amount of a certain prescription medication that a person takes is based on the person's weight. A person that weighs 140 pounds takes 105 milligrams, and a person that weighs 180 pounds takes 130 milligrams. It says use the midpoint formula to estimate how many milligrams a person weighing 160 pounds should take if the milligrams follow a linear pattern. So what we're saying here is if a linear pattern, that means they're going to fall in a straight line. So in other words, your increase here is going to be the same. So here we're looking at as the person goes from 140 pounds to 180, the milligrams are going from 105 to 130. So basically what that means when we say it follows a linear pattern, if we were to plot the points, then they're going to fall in a nice straight line. So a way to think of this, if they tell us that a person that weighs 140 pounds, and I'm just going to kind of mark off, here's a person that's 140 pounds. I'll just pick a point here. Someone that weighs 140 pounds, they're going to take 105 milligrams. So I'll think of that as my y-coordinate. So the x here is pounds. Our y-axis would be representing the milligrams. So this point here we could think of as a 140-pound person that has to take 105 milligrams. And then later on this particular line, we're going to have a person that weighs 180, and it says that they're going to have to take 130 milligrams. And we want to figure out, using the midpoint formula, how many milligrams that a person weighing 160 pounds should take. Well, the reason they say use the midpoint formula, because if you realize, if we're going from 140 to 180, then again, this is on the x-axis. If you think of 140 pounds to 180, then the midpoint here would be a person that would weigh 160 pounds. So what we're trying to determine is, what is the y-coordinate here for this midpoint? In other words, how many milligrams would this person have to take? So if you recall, the midpoint formula says you're simply going to add your x values together. So x1 plus x2 divided by 2, and then y1 plus y2 divided by 2. So for our example, I'm going to call this one x1, y1, and this point would be x2 and y2. So if we're going to calculate here this particular midpoint, then we would plug in our values, our x1 plus x2, so it's 140 plus 180, all divided by 2, and then y1, 105 plus y2 is 130, so 105 plus 130, all over 2. And if you simply do the calculations here, we will find out that 140 plus 180 is 320 over 2. 105 plus 130 is 235 over 2. And we end up with 320 over 2 is 160, and 235 over 2 is 117.5. So what that tells us here is this is our y value, and that does match up with our point where we had the 160. So here we had 160, so this is showing us that we have our 160-pound person. What do they need to take? The amount of milligrams. Then that means they're going to have to take 117.5 milligrams of this particular prescription.